Primer designing has different rules that we see in different resources. One of them is about primer length. They say it should be around 18 to 24 nucleotides, and most of the times they work. Primers have to bind to the right location like this and in the right orientation. But while all this range would work, and even greater longer primers as well as shorter primers to some extent will work, what we have found is normally 22 nucleotides are greater length primers give reproducible results. They are very reliable in my opinion, and in our group experiments we have seen that. Of course, in addition, sometimes other than the primer, we have to include certain nucleotides in the 5' end of the primer. Now, this is the 3' end of the template sequence. For the primer, this is the 5' end, right? So this was the 5', now it's here. We add, other than the sequence we found in the template, we add new nucleotides, for example, restriction sites or some other things for mutations, etc. We might add. They will not bind to the template, but this part in the 5' end, which will not interfere in polymerization, this will become part of the PCR product, and that is intentionally done. When we do that, the primer length can increase beyond 25 or 28, sometimes more than 30 also, which is okay. But generally we try to keep the primer length to 21 nucleotide. Now, primer length itself has a relationship with other rules such as secondary structure formation, and we should avoid, they say. Specificity should be taken care of, they say. Secondary structures we have not found to be very important, and they don't bother us, like hairpin loop formation. It may happen, but it's okay, I feel. Specificity, on the contrary, we don't ignore. That's very important. But it's sort of taken care of by the primer length. The longer the primer, the higher the possibility that it is very specific to the location it is binding. Okay, so that's about primer length. But before I move on, I should say the list I am making of the rules are from different standard sources that everybody will find in textbooks, etc. But these additional points I'm making about the not secondary structure not being important, or 22 nucleotides or longer sequences are more reliable. These are our own conclusions from general observations where we have done several hundreds of PCRs, let's say RT-PCRs, RT-qPCRs. That's an observation from that type of studies in our group. We mostly work on human species, but then things may change. But I think this pretty much applies to a lot of other species as well. However, we have not specifically explored the efficacy of primer designing rules in general. Okay, we're not done specific experiments like that. Anyway, that's about primer designing. Now the rules that from the textbooks, etc., will continue like this. They talk about percentage of G's and C's, and these perhaps are important, but we generally tend to ignore them for various reasons. I'll not get into the details. And melting temperature is another parameter where again we ignore quite a few rules, but not this one. The primers in a pair must have very similar melting temperature, if possible identical. That's rule number one for us. In general, melting temperature, if it is different between the primers, if it is lesser than 1, that is ideal. If it is increasing, it's a concern, but up to 5 maybe we can manage. If it is beyond 5, it is not worth trying such primers. I mean, it's just one can take a chance, but it may or may not work. Then people say you should watch out for secondary structures of different natures, and then primer dimers. This is important. Primer dimers could be important, not a great concern, but sometimes this is a matter of reasonable concern in my opinion. What happens is, if a primer, forward primer for example, has its 3' end, there is something which is overlapping with the other primer. In such situations, we get a dimer because polymerase comes and binds and it elongates here, and this could interfere in taking out the primers. Primers are consumed mainly for forming the dimers, or sometimes it has an equal product length and you don't know whether the product was formed or the primer dimer has been formed. So it is better to be cautious about primer dimers. About the specificity, I already talked about a little bit. That is rule number 2. That's definitely important, and we have to make sure that they are really specific, and we perform blasts sometimes. In addition, repetitive sequences we should avoid. These are some of the major rules that we find. Just to summarize, I have marked those which we ignore, except the fact that greater than 21 nucleotide should be the primer length. Primer dimers we should avoid, and then the most important rules are have matching melting temperature and ensure specificity of the primers, because that's what matters in PCR success. Now, experimentally validating the primer designing software, that becomes very critical in this context. And unfortunately, most of the primer designing software are not experimentally validated. They are being very commonly used because most of the primers work. But I think it is very important, and we got very great, very exciting insights when we were trying to test our own primer designing software, which is recently reported in Journal of Biotechnology. We have done more than 250, we have generated more than 250 primers pairs with this tool, and we have tested them experimentally, and we got some good insights. So you can use the tool here and also see this video about if you want to look at brief introduction to the entire experimental validation story I was talking about. Now I should thank Dr. Prabhakar Reddy. He was my mentor in United States in the University of Virginia, where I learned first time about primer designing and all that. And he, of course, I also learned quite a few molecular biology techniques from him. So thanks to him. And of course, after that, when I came back to India, I have students like Govind who have been doing experiments, and I have learned quite a bit from their observations as well. And that has been good. So I'm trying to bring that in simple terms to you. It took a little longer time than I anticipated, but if you're interested in knowing more about primer designing and PCR itself, there are similar videos I have made, including this video. So please do try and visit them. Thank you very much.